Another one is I'd like to say is, what do you think about the claim that that Republicans are a small government party?
Demonstrably false by history. If I wrote an article about this on my website, MyTwoCentsVideos.com, why government elections are a farce, and then I did make an audio version that's on my YouTube channel. But if you examine history, you'll find that no matter who is sitting in the White House, no matter who controls Congress, two things always happen every presidential term. Spending increases and the government increases in the scope of its authority. I challenge anyone to show me one government regulation that was ever repealed that wasn't replaced by at least two additional regulations. One government agency that ever opened its doors that then closed it, or at least wasn't replaced by an equivalent agency. And whether it was Republicans in the White House, whether it was Democrats, this is always the case. And honestly, it's in like, I'm not going to say that Republicans or Democrats are more evil. I think obviously there are certain Republican politicians and certain Democratic politicians that have both done really horrible things. But one thing that I found more insidious about how about the Republican strategy is take Trump's tax cuts, for example. Everyone in conservatism talked about how great it was that Trump cut taxes, how great that was going to be for the economy. Well, as Ron Paul and others pointed out, the tax cuts are not met with a corresponding drop in spending, which means that in order to cover the government debt, the Treasury is going to have to issue more debt securities. When it issues, and if you it's beyond the scope of this conversation to explain exactly how this works. So I would say that Mike Maloney's series, Hidden Secrets of Money, explains this process well. But basically, whenever the government issues more debt securities, what in effect happens is the Federal Reserve prints more money out of thin air and then buys those debt securities, giving the government new money that didn't exist before, which lowers the value of the dollar. So even though Trump gave us tax cuts, certain people don't have to pay more taxes. This inevitably results to cover the increased government spending. The government's just going to have to print more money. When it does that, the money you have will now be worth less. So even though the government didn't technically take any money that you had in your bank account, the money in your bank account is now worth less. And thus it was still a wealth transfer from the people to the government, no different than if they just taxed it outright. Are Republicans small government? They claim that they are, but if you look at history, if you look at politicians' actual voting record, you'll find that when push comes to shove, they're just as big government as Democrats, and that's because the state cannot. There is no such thing as a small, limited government. When you put people to act in their own self-interest, and when you give certain people authority that other people don't have, inevitably they will use that for their own interests, which will inevitably lead to the growth of the state.